Welcome to Marx 913. Welcome to this session on the Grundrisse and on Toni Negri's book, Marx Beyond Marx, Lessons on the Grundrisse. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to Marx 913. The Grundrisse is a set of unpublished notes contained mainly in 7 manuscript notebooks that Marx used as a preparative for the writing of his 2 published works on political economy, a contribution to the critique of political economy, which was published in 1859, and Capital, the first volume of which was published in 1867. The manuscripts are the fruit of his research on political economy conducted at the British Library in the British Museum after he had moved to London, mainly in the years 1857 to 1858. The Grundrisse appeared late in the reception of Marx. It had not been collected and assembled and put together by Engels, and it only became known in the West in the mid-1950s. So it's of more recent vintage than, say, the Paris manuscripts of 1844, which were first published and then discovered by readers of Marx in 1932, or the Brussels manuscripts, the German ideology, which was also discovered by readers in 1932. The Grundrisse, a hefty volume running about 1,000 pages, has become the urtext for those readers of Marx who have sought to infuse the more scientific and economistic later Marx of the Capital with the earlier philosophical, political, and social theoretic Marx of the 1940s. For these readers, it serves as the final bridge to Capital. It still contains traces of the early philosophical theory of alienation from the Paris manuscripts, and in fact it hints at how those ideas of alienation are transformed into questions of fetishism. It still retains a conversation with Hegel, this time with Hegel's Science of Logic. And Marx explicitly discusses how his thinking is influenced by Hegel's logic. Marx emphasizes the centrality of social relations, in other words, of social theory, in all of the economic categories that he develops in the Grundrisse, whether it's money, value, capital. He speaks of the subjectivities of the workers. He discusses their consciousness of self, their consciousness of being for another, he says, and being for self. He emphasizes the conflict and struggle between capital and the workers. The biggest exchange process, he writes, is not that between commodities, but that between commodities and labor. Of course, to which Toni Negri exclaims in his book, Marx Beyond Marx, boom, the first big leap, the first of the political excursuses of the Grundrisse. In short, the Grundrisse ties the future political economic work of the Capital back in a prefigural backward gaze to all of the preceding philosophical, political, militant, historical, and social theoretic work that Marx had done in the 1980s, in the 1840s, and the early 1850s. It's a text that reveals Marx's cheminement. It's a French term for kind of like a slow movement on a path forward. Marx's cheminement to his elaborated critique of political economy. Now, in its reception, the Grundrisse has been particularly appreciated by those who have found Capital to be somewhat demobilizing politically. It's been particularly appreciated by people like Toni Negri, who believe that Capital has too often been, quote, interpreted in an objectivist and determinist fashion to justify reactionary politics. The Grundrisse, thus, is of particular appeal to those thinkers who would prefer to emphasize the political and militant dimensions or the social theoretic dimensions of Marx's mature economic writings. At her keynote lecture for Marx 1313, for instance, Sheila Ben Habib emphasized the social theoretic aspects of the manuscripts. The Grundrisse is an important text, Ben Habib suggested, because it lays out Marx's social theory, within which Marx embeds his economic analysis. When you read the Grundrisse, Ben Habib said, you understand that all these categories, modes of production, forces of production, history as the history of struggle, how the forces of production develop so much that they act against relations of production, etc. All of those categories are all anchored in social relations. What is a mode of production? Is it an instrument? No, Ben Habib says. It's a social relation. It's an institution. So what Marx shows in the Grundrisse, she says brilliantly, is the totality of social relations in different formations, pre-capitalist and capitalist, and a brilliant analysis of exchange. All these more mechanistic distinctions, they cannot be discussed without talking about relations of production. And she says the Grundrisse is such an incredibly rich work in that sense. Now, at Marx 9:13, Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra will highlight the political reading of the Grundrisse, drawing on the work of Toni Negri from his lectures on the Grundrisse from 1978, published under the title Marx Beyond Marx, Lessons on the Grundrisse. And in that work, Negri meticulously demonstrates how the Grundrisse operates as a praxis-oriented manual to guide revolutionary action. Negri shows how, in his words, quote, the revolutionary subject emerges from the relation with capital through a process that makes possible what he calls, quote, the auto-determination of the subject that can then modify the processes of capitalism. And in that idea of auto-determination of the subject, of course, you have prefigured, post-figured as well, the whole autonomia movement and the movement for operaismo, workerism. Now, with the recent publication of David Harvey's book, A Companion to Marx's Grundrisse in 2023, following on the works of Roman Rozdolsky, Toni Negri, and others, we are perhaps at the high point of the Grundrisse's influence on the reception of Marx's political economic writings. Whether the Grundrisse as an autonomous, standalone book will continue to exert such influence is unclear. Like the German ideology, which has now begun to disintegrate back into the mass of unpublished manuscripts and notebooks in the new Mega 2 edition of the complete works of Marx and Engels, the Grundrisse as well may lose its integrity as a single volume, as a unified text that we refer to, as a result of the new Mega 2 edition, the Marx-Engels works in German. It will, in a way, possibly disintegrate or lose its integrity because it is returning into kind of the mass of the nachlass, of the unpublished notebooks. As Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra write in their essay for Marx 9:13, which is posted on the website, in the most recent edition of the Marx-Engels complete works, Mega 2, the Grundrisse effectively disappears among a sea of other drafts written by Marx during the late 1850s and early 1860s. With this philological turn, despite all the gains it implies, there is a risk to lose the clarity and political effects that previous publication of the Grundrisse provided. Before its disappearance, then, we will reread Marx's Grundrisse in conversation with Toni Negri's Marx Beyond Marx. And for this session, we are privileged to welcome to 9:13 two brilliant critical philosophers, Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra, who themselves collaborated so closely with Negri for decades. Notably, in Toni Negri's book, Marx in Movement, Negri traces the different phases of the workerist movement and its development from its origin in the 1960s through the work on social reproduction and the wages for housework movement of the 1970s, beyond the European focus in the 1980s to the third phase in the 1990s with the birth of neoliberalism and financial mediations in post-Fordism. And Negri concludes precisely with the work of our two guests. He writes, and then there were the studies of Michael Hart, Sando Mizadra, and Brett Nielsen on global migration and the international dimension of the class struggle. Michael Hart would go on to co-author important books with Negri, including Empire, Commonwealth, Multitude, and Assembly. Hart and Mizadra would also co-author important works, including most recently in 2023, Bolivia Beyond the Impasse. So it's a treat to have them with us today at the seminar. Now, in this longer introduction here, I'm going to provide background on the two texts that we will be reading for Marx 9:13. Let me start then with the context and the publication history of the Grundrisse. Marx's study of political economy, which he had begun in Paris in 1844 in notebooks that he kept at the time, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, his work on political economy at that time was interrupted by his extensive writings against the young Hegelians and against Proudhon, and then interrupted by the French and German revolutions of 1848 and 1849, and interrupted by his founding and editing of the new Rhenish Gazette. Marx began to return to his study of political economy in 1850, right after he had moved to London, and then re-immersed himself in classical political economy at the British Library during that period, while he was, of course, preoccupied with journalistic writings as well, especially the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, writings for the New York Daily Tribune, also a series of other publications. So while he's kind of working on those, he is returning to the classics of political economy, the beginning, 1850, 1851, 52, and then it goes deep into his study of political economy in 1857 and 58, which produces these manuscripts that are published as the Grundrisse. Now, Marx gives a very good account of this period in his intellectual biography in the preface of a contribution to the critique of political economy from 1859. And he writes, the publication of the Neue Zeitliche Zeitung in 1848 and 1849 and subsequent events cut short my economic studies, which I could only resume in London in 1850. The enormous amount of material relating to the history of political economy assembled in the British Museum, the fact that London is a convenient vantage point for the observation of bourgeois society, and finally, the new stage of development which this society seemed to have entered with the discovery of gold in California and Australia, induced me to start again from the very beginning and to work carefully through the new material. These studies led partly, of their own accord, to apparently quite remote subjects on which I had to spend a certain amount of time. But it was in particular the imperative necessity of earning my living which reduced the time at my disposal. My collaboration continued now for 8 years with the New York Tribune, the leading Anglo-American newspaper, necessitated an excessive fragmentation of my studies, for I wrote only exceptionally newspaper correspondence in the strict sense. Since a considerable part of my contributions consisted of articles dealing with important economic events in Britain and on the continent, I was compelled to become conversant with practical details which, strictly speaking, lie outside the sphere of political economy. So then, it's then in the summer of 18 1957, then, that Marx begins redacting a series of manuscript notebooks that would be published under the title Grundrisse der Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, so Foundations of the Critique of Political Economy. Marx writes these notebooks in the shadow of a financial crisis, especially in the United States, and the possibility of monetary crises, and these are motivating him to write day and night into the earliest hours of morning. Quote, "I'm working like a madman for whole nights in order to coordinate my work on economics and to get together the Grundrisse before the deluge," Marx writes to Engels on December 12, 1857. He's using this research to understand the financial crisis that he is living through as a way both to kind of actualize his theories of political economy and determine a political praxis. The notebook manuscripts were not published during Marx's lifetime. So in terms of their reception, they only really come into existence for a Western audience in the 1950s. The notebooks were not published during Marx's lifetime, and they were not assembled for publication by Engels, who, as you know from previous seminars, had done a pretty exhaustive job of publishing unpublished work. But he didn't publish the Grundrisse. As Marcello Musto suggests, it's likely that not even Friedrich Engels read the Grundrisse. Engels never mentioned the Grundrisse, either in his prefaces to the 2 volumes of Capital that he saw into print, or in any of his own vast collection of letters. As Musto recounts in a detailed chapter on the reception of Grundrisse, which I recommend to you, and it's in the readings later on, the introduction to the work was published in German in 1903 by Karl Kautsky and translated into several languages. But just the introduction, the tome itself of practically 1,000 pages, remained unpublished and pretty much unknown. So while the introduction existed in about 1903, 1904, the work itself was never published at that time. The full voluminous edition of the Grundrisse was first published in 1939 to 1941, right in the middle of World War II, by the Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute in Moscow. But it was hardly disseminated. And, of course, coming in the middle of World War II, or at the beginning of World War II, or when it comes out, it's in the middle of World War II, it's published in Moscow, it was effectively unknown. According to Roman Rozdolsky, who discovered a copy in a public library, there were only a handful of copies of this first 1939-41 edition that reached the West. Ultimately, the Grundrisse was then republished in German in 1953 by Dietz Verlag in East Berlin. Dietz Verlag was the publishing press of the Socialist Unity Party of Germany in East Germany, which was the ruling party at the time. And it's at that point that it becomes known to Western readers. Marcello Musto recounts the odd publication history of the first Soviet edition from the 1939-41 period. He writes, "Although the editorial guidelines and the form of publication were similar, the Grundrisse was not included in the volumes of the Mega, of the Marx-Engels collected edition in German, but appeared in a separate edition. Furthermore, the proximity of the Second World War meant that the work remained virtually unknown. The 3,000 copies soon became very rare, and only a few managed to cross the Soviet frontiers. The Grundrisse did not feature in the Russian edition of the works of Marx and Engels, and its first republication in German had to wait until 1953. Marcello Musto adds, while it is astonishing that a text such as the Grundrisse was published at all during the Stalin period, heretical as it surely was with regard to the then indisputed canons of Diamat, Soviet-style dialectical materialism, we should also bear in mind that it was then the most important of Marx's writings not to be circulating in Germany. Its eventual publication in East Berlin in 3,000 copies was part of the celebrations marking Karl Marx's Jahr, the 70th anniversary of its author's death, and the 150th anniversary of his birth. Written in 1857-58, Musto writes, the Grundrisse was only available to be read throughout the world from 1953, after 100 years of solitude. And for English readers, actually, it was delayed even further. It took 20 years for the Grundrisse to get translated into the first edition, English edition, which appeared in 1973. Now, as for the exact dates of the materials contained in the 1939-1941 edition of the Grundrisse, Toni Negri, in his book, Marx Beyond Marx, details these dates exactly. The introduction to the Grundrisse, which was a single notebook, the notebook M, was written from August to September 1857. Then the 7 notebooks that are numbered and dated by Marx himself, except for the first one, came in the following order. Number 1 was October 1857, 2 was around November of 1857, the third was November to December 57, the fourth mid-December 57, February 58, 5, 58, January through February, 6 was February 58, and then the last one, the 7th, was February through March, ending in May or June of 1858. And then the secondary texts that make up the appendix, most of them were also written in 1857, but then there were a number of additional minor passages and short texts, some of which went back actually to the 1850, 1853. Those were a series of extracts from Ricardo's work. And then there were some short texts that were also written in 58 to 59. So it spans this area, but it's pretty much continuous and chronological in its writing. As noted earlier, the new edition of the complete works of Marx and Engels, the Mega 2, is changing the way we think about the Grundrisse as a book of its own. I had mentioned at Marx 513 that we may need to refer to the German ideology in the future as the Brussels manuscripts of 1845, a bit like the Paris manuscripts of 1844. Perhaps at some point in the future we will refer to the Grundrisse simply as the London manuscripts of 1857-58. All right, now let me discuss a few of the highlights from the Grundrisse. Now, given the different receptions and the readings of Grundrisse and the varying readings of Grundrisse, it's difficult to present highlights without giving a spin. But the text is dense, and many consider it impenetrable, so I will try to propose an account of some of the important contributions of the text as a way to set the stage for Toni Negri's interpretation in Marx Beyond Marx. Let's start then with the introduction, which had received the most attention. Marx makes several important points in his introduction. An introduction which appears to have been written before rather than after the substantive work of the 7 notebooks. I tend to prefer introductions that are written after the material rather than before, but it's interesting that this introduction was actually written to prefigure what he was going to be working on. Marx positions his work by opposition both to the classical political economists and to contemporary radical thinkers like Proudhon, Bastiat, and others. And as the introduction makes clear, he's using those two sets of foils to articulate his own views. Let me focus on 3 points in particular. First, where to start the study of political economy. Marx argues that different regimes of political economy, feudal regimes, capitalist regimes, etc., are necessarily situated in history and call for different entry points to the analysis. To study a feudal economy, it might make sense to start with land ownership and agriculture. In fact, as the physiocrats did, mistakenly though, since they were at the cusp of the transformation to a bourgeois society and therefore missed the industrialization that was so important. By contrast to a feudal economy, where you would start with agriculture and land ownership, to study a bourgeois society, Marx argues, one must begin with production, and not any kind of production, not agricultural production, but the production of commodities. Capital, he writes, is the all-dominating economic power of bourgeois society. It must form the starting point as well as the finishing point, and must be dealt with before landed property, he says. After both have been examined in particular, their interrelation must be examined. So in this regard, Marx sets aside the tradition of classical political economists and modern political theorists, so Adam Smith, Ricardo, but also Rousseau, who begin with the individual, whether it's the individual hunter or fisherman or gatherer, or whether it's Robinson Crusoe. He wants to start from a different place. Not only then is he going to start with kind of the production sphere rather than agriculture and land ownership, but he's also going to start with a different entity, not the individual or the Robinson Crusoe, but instead, as we'll see, the kind of elemental building blocks, the concrete building blocks. The natural individual, he says, is an illusion to start there. The individual in nature is by no means the natural state of existence and should not be the origin point. By contrast to thinkers like Rousseau, who believed that there was first the individual and then civilization, for better or for worse, and of course for worse for Rousseau, Marx argues that there were first collectivities, clans, communal societies, and that only with some form of social development does it become possible for the individual to emerge. For the individual to emerge with self-interests and a real conception of their subjectivity. The human being is, Marx emphasizes, a political animal, he says, or as he writes, an animal which can individuate itself only in the midst of society. So Marx casts aside any approach that begins with the individual as the rudimentary building block, focusing instead on the economic system and, in the case of capitalism, with production at a certain point in that scheme of production. Second, Marx views capitalism specifically, and regimes of political economy more generally, as a system, as a totality. It is comprised of different moments, but it constitutes a whole. Some of the different moments include production, exchange, distribution, consumption, and circulation. Marx emphasizes that these different moments, though, cannot be isolated and treated exclusively from each other. They all form part of one totalizing system, one organic whole. And so they have to be studied in unison. This is important because it's the basis of his critique of Proudhon and other socialists, who do not propose changes to production but call instead for changes to distribution. This is actually the model of welfare economics as well, right? And welfare economists. Do not touch production, allow it to be as efficient as possible, generate as much wealth as possible, and then just tax and transfer. In other words, distribute differently. Tinker only with the distribution mechanisms of wealth, not the production. Marx argues that focusing on distribution alone fails to understand how all the pieces are inextricably linked and work together. And so what Marx will propose is focusing on production in its entirety and relation and exchange and circulation, etc., with a radical transformation of the entire production process. Now, although all of those moments, production, exchange, circulation, etc., are integrated and form a whole, Marx argues that the best entry point to study bourgeois society, to study bourgeois capitalism, is production, which is privileged in the sense that the economic cycle always rejuvenates through production. Marx writes in the introduction, "The conclusion we reach is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. Production predominates not only over itself in the antithetical definition of production, but over the other moments as well. The process always returns to production to begin anew. A definite production thus determines a definite consumption, distribution, and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. Admittedly, however, it is in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. Mutual interaction takes place between the different moments. This is the case with every organic whole," he says. So one can hear both the idea here that this is an organic whole, but also the idea that there's a slight privilege for production, which ends up meaning that Marx is going to start his analysis with production, although he does not consider it as a separate thing, entity, from the organic whole. Everything is integrated. But you hear in the passage that I just read both the idea of a totality, of a unity, of an organic whole, and the fact that production is the best place to start, although it's not a separate entity. All right, third, methodologically, the work of classical political economists often focused on the category of the population, Marx says. The population broadly. Incidentally, this term population might remind you of Foucault's lecture, Security, Territory, Population, where Foucault begins to argue that biopolitics focuses on populations. Here too, Marx argues that classical political economists focus on the population. But this too, Marx argues, is an illusion and far too abstract and general. Instead, Marx argues, one needs to start by focusing at the more concrete level. He writes, "The population is an abstraction if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. These classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I am not familiar with the elements on which they rest, e.g., wage labor, capital, etc. These latter, in turn, presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, etc." And so, Marx proposes the proper entry point for an analysis of political economy from the point of production has to be the concrete categories, such as money, price, value, capital, And from this, of course, Marx concludes his introduction with a plan for a book on political economy. A first plan, which is, in a way, an outline, perhaps, for a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, or maybe even for later on for Capital. Where he kind of sets out, this is on page 108 of the vintage edition, right, where he sets out, right, the different categories that he's going to study. The categories which make up the inner structure of bourgeois society, in which the fundamental classes rest: capital, wage labor, right? And then later going towards exchange and circulation, and then later going towards taxes, state debt, the population, the colonies, international exchange, and then finally the world market and crises. The Grundrisse will actually include several such plans for a book, and Roman Rozdolsky, in his meticulous recounting of the stepwise progression to the publication of Capital, studies them all, these different plans for the book. This is in his early book, The Making of Marx's Capital, from 1968, which is a bit of a foundational text to readers of the Grundrisse and the Capital, where he really studies the different plans and charts their interrelationships. Okay. After the introduction comes a chapter on money. So Marx begins, as promised, at the most concrete level with money. But instead of developing his own theory of money, he opens the chapter with a critique of the proposals of Proudhon and Alfred d'Arimont, Proudhonists, who had come up with proposals to transform the monetary system. Proudhon, d'Arimont, others had offered several different proposals to fundamentally restructure the money, banking, and financial systems in order to free up restrictions on credit and make money available to small artisans so that they would have more access to credit and could develop their trades and gain self-sufficiency. Marx criticizes their proposals. He attacks the idea that transforming the monetary system would somehow revolutionize society. He rejects any notion that reforming the banking system would have much effect on the other moments of production, distribution, or exchange. Marx poses the question in a straightforward way on page 122 of the Grundrisse. The general question would be this: can the existing relations of production and the relations of distribution which correspond to them be revolutionized by a change in the instrument of circulation, in the organization of circulation? Further question: can such a transformation of circulation be undertaken without touching the existing relations of production and the social relations which rest on them? Now, his answer is a clear no. Transforming the monetary system, replacing the money currency with other ideas like time chits or labor money or credit money or other alternatives is not a way to transform society. As Marx writes, various forms of money may correspond better to social production in various stages. One form may remedy evils against which another is powerless, but none of them, as long as they remain forms of money, and as long as money remains an essential relation of production, is capable of overcoming the contradictions inherent in the money relation, and can instead only hope to reproduce these contradictions in one or another form. One form of wage labor may correct the abuses of another, but no form of wage labor can correct the abuses of wage labor itself. So the bottom line is that the existing forms of money and the institutions of credit are only one moment in the overall kind of organic whole of the production system, and therefore cannot bring about a revolutionary transformation. For Marx, it's simply an illusion to believe that the banking system itself regulates the whole system, or that money has independent objective power. Money ultimately comes down to social relations. And it's in this context that Marx then develops early thoughts on value and price, which we will develop and refine, of course, in his published works on political economy. We see here the early formulations and experiments with these concrete categories. For instance, we see Marx developing the theory that what determines value is not the amount of labor time that any one person puts into the production of a commodity, but the amount of labor time necessary, socially necessary at any given historical period in that moment of production. The value of commodities, as he writes, quote, is determined by their cost of production, in other words, by the labor time required to produce them. Marx distinguishes this concept of value from the price of a commodity, which is determined by market forces. Those two differ in a form of contradiction that can be understood, Marx says, in Hegelian terms. Most importantly, Marx argues that value is, at its core, a social relation, like money. It is perhaps the key point of the chapter, this thesis that money, value, commodities, and later capital are embodied social relations. It's the critical praxis move, both the intellectual and practical move, that is at the heart of these manuscripts, namely to show that the categories boil down to social relations. In other words, they may all seem like external objects independent of us, determining outcomes, but they are in fact nothing more than the product of social relations. They embody our human interactions. Marx writes here on page 144, he writes, Thus, in order to realize the commodity as exchange value in one stroke, and in order to give it the general influence of an exchange value, it is not enough to exchange it for one particular commodity. It must be exchanged against a third thing, which is not in turn itself a particular commodity, but is the symbol of the commodity as commodity, of the commodity's exchange value itself, which thus represents, he emphasizes, say, labor time as such, say, a piece of paper or of leather, which represents a fractional part of labor time. And then he writes in parenthesis, such a symbol presupposes general recognition. It can only be a social symbol. It expresses indeed nothing more than a social relation. It expresses nothing more than a social relation. This is a key contribution of the Grundrisse. The tension between the transcendental power, say, of money, right? How money becomes this external object that is seemingly independent of us, autonomous. The tension between that and the fact that it is nothing more than social relations is what will motivate the later notion of fetishism in Capital. In the Grundrisse, it's still expressed through the language of alienation from the Paris manuscripts of 1844. Here, it's still about an objective type of alienation, how individuals in production become subordinated to relations that feel independent of them but are not. But that will, of course, change over the next few years. Marx closes the chapter on money with a discussion of wealth, which he distinguishes from value. He argues that wealth turns into the main object, the aim, the desire, and it turns into greed and accumulation. The possession of money, he writes, places me in exactly the same relationship towards wealth in the social context as the philosopher's stone would towards the sciences. And then, of course, what follows is a marvelous disquisition on page 222, where he writes, "Money is therefore not only an object, but is the object of greed. It is essentially auri sacra fames." This is from Virgil's Aeneid. It is essentially that accursed hunger for gold. Greed, as such, as a particular form of the drive, i.e. as distinct from the craving of a particular kind of wealth, e.g. for clothes, weapons, jewels, women, wine, etc., is possible only when general wealth as such has become individualized in a particular thing, as soon as money is posited in its third quality. Money is therefore not only the object, but also the fountainhead of greed. The mania for possessions is possible without money, but greed itself is the product of a definite social development, not natural, as opposed to historical. Hence, the wailing of the ancients about money as the source of all evil. All right, then after the chapter on money is the lengthy chapter on capital. So from money, Marx turns to money as capital in a stepwise progression intended to take the reader to production and the different moments that follow: distribution, exchange, realization, circulation, etc. The burden of the lengthy chapter on capital is to explain what capital is and show how it is transformed in the production process. Marx begins with money as capital, demonstrating how money can be used to make more money. Now, it's at this juncture that Marx develops that key contribution of the Grundrisse again, namely that, coming at it from a different angle, namely the argument that capital is not a thing, as the classical political economists suggested, but rather a process. And not just any kind of process, but one that goes through all the moments from production through circulation, continuously expanding and bringing about endless accumulation as the drive for more wealth leads to the accumulation of more capital. In this thesis, what is key, again, is that capital, like money, is not just a thing, but is a social relation. It may appear as a thing, and for this reason become the focus of our critiques, right, which criticize that object. But in fact, it is really social relations, and those social relations are what should be properly critiqued. This anticipates, naturally, the argument about the fetishization of commodities and capital. Here, Marx is explicit about its makeup as social relations. Discussing money as capital, he writes on page 238, he writes, the special difficulty in grasping money in its fully developed character as money, right, a difficulty which political economy attempts to evade by forgetting now one, now another aspect, and by appealing to one aspect when confronted with the other. And let me start again because that clause confuses things. The special difficulty in grasping money in its fully developed character as money is that a social relation, a definite relation between individuals, here appears as a metal, a stone, as a purely physical, external thing, which can be found as such in nature and which is undistinguishable in form from its natural existence. Capital becomes naturalized and and people do not see the social relations that make it up. Critics then go after the object, as if the object was the problem. Excuse me. Marx continues. The illusion that metallic money allegedly falsifies exchange arises out of total ignorance of its nature. One or another kind of artful tinkering with money is then proposed to overcome the contradictions of which money is merely the perceptible appearance. Equally clear that some revolutionary operations can be performed with money, insofar as an attack on it seems to leave everything else as it was, and only to rectify it. Then one strikes a blow at the sack, intending the donkey. However, as long as the donkey does not feel the blows on the sack, one hits, in fact, only the sack, and not the donkey. As soon as he feels it, one strikes the donkey, and not the sack. As soon as these operations are detected against money as such, they are merely an attack on consequences whose causes remain unaffected, i.e., disturbance of the productive process, whose solid basis then also has the power, by means of a more or less violent reaction, to define and to dominate these as mere passing disturbances. You need to hit the donkey, right? Not the sack. You need to understand social relations, right? And not gold or the stone or the object as some transcendental object. This and other passages show clearly how closely Marx is tuning his analysis to praxis, and how much of it rests on the grounding that these categories, money, capital, etc., are all formed by relations between people, social relations. It is in this sense that Toni Negri would write that, quote, while in capital the categories are generally modeled on private and competitive capital, in the Grundrisse they are modeled on a tendential scheme of social capital. Now, Marx critiques the political economists, both classical and Proudhonian, who see freedom and equality in the reciprocity of exchange. Those ideals of freedom and equality are naturalized by capital, but betrayed by the reality of the labor processes. Marx refers to this as the utopian inability to grasp the necessary difference between the real and the ideal form of bourgeois society, which is the cause of their desire to undertake the superfluous business of realizing the ideal expression again, which is in fact only the inverted projection of this reality. In bourgeois society, Marx explains, capital is viewed as, and here he cites Adam Smith, it's viewed as accumulated, realized labor, properly objectified labor, which serves as the means for new labor production. But it is not anything like that, he argues, since this misconstrues capital as a thing. Marx emphasized, capital is conceived as a thing, not as a relation. But capital is not a simple relation. It is a process in whose various moments it is always capital. This process, therefore, to be developed. And of course, these are notes. So what he's saying is this is the most important thing. This is process. This process of social relations is what needs to be developed. And of course, that's what he does in the rest of the Grundrisse. Marx develops in the chapter on capital a theory of surplus value to explain how money and capital constantly expands. He shows how capital is to be understood as a process of becoming. He discusses competition and overproduction, and how the quest to generate surplus value creates surplus products that are not then easily exchanged in the market, resulting in devaluation and the need to expand markets. He explains how value is realized first in production, then in market exchange, how alienated labor and alienated capital are in struggle with each other, how circulation realizes value in the market, how money and capital circulate throughout the different moments of the organic whole, coursing through production into the markets and turning back into the monetary form. This is, of course, practically a 1,000-page text, so there's a lot more to it, but I hope that this gives us a sense of what he's doing in the Grundrisse. Now, at a philosophical level, the Grundrisse is the work that intersects most closely with Hegel's science of logic. We had seen earlier how Marx had focused on other texts of Hegel. In his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right in 1843, and the published introduction to that work in 1844, Marx had naturally engaged the philosophy of right. In his Paris manuscripts, the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx had engaged primarily Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. Here, by contrast, it is Hegel's logic that comes to the fore. The work understanding kind of dialectical reasoning, other forms of negation and negation of negation. As far as the method of the Grundrisse goes, Marx writes to Engels in 1858, the fact of having leafed through, once again, by mere accident, Hegel's logic rendered me a great service. The readers of the Grundrisse can see this clearly in passages scattered throughout the notebooks. So, for instance, in his discussion of market value in the chapter on money, Marx explains that the market value of a commodity is never equated with its real value, as if the latter were a third party, but rather by means of constant non-equation of itself. And then he adds, in parenthesis, as Hegel would say, not by way of abstract identity, but by constant negation of the negation, i.e., of itself as negation of real value. The concept of the negation was something that was especially important for Marx and would become important as well for famous post-Marxian thinkers like Theodor Adorno. In his letter to Engels, Marx goes on to write that, if I ever find the time for a work of this type, I would greatly desire to make accessible to the intellect of the common man how much there is in Hegel's method of rationality and mystification. According to Toni Negri, this is a reference by Marx to a methodological synthesis. This idea of rationality and mystification, it's a methodological synthesis of critique and praxis, or what Negri calls the spirit of theoretico-practical synthesis. Incidentally, Marx's relation to Hegel's logic is the subject of a full-length treatment, a monograph by Hiroshi Ushida called Marx's Grundrisse and Hegel's Logic. Okay, so that gives you some background on the Grundrisse itself. Let's turn now to Antonio Negri's book, Marx Beyond. Marx, Lessons on the Grundrisse. Now, it's important to realize that different texts of Marx play different roles in the intellectual development of different thinkers, as well as in the intellectual development of movements and political praxis. And so we've seen this. We've seen the way in which, for instance, the Paris manuscripts played an important role, for instance, in Marcuse's thinking in 1932, and how particular Marxian thinkers or thinkers who are engaging Marx will turn to different periods, different segments, different periods of Marx's work, either to get it to the more philosophical in the earlier Marx, or to get to the more scientific, economistic in the later Marx. It's also important to understand that there are evolutions within a thinker's relation to these different texts, and evolutions in social movements' relation to different texts. Now, the Grundrisse played a key role for Toni Negri, in large part because it was on his reading kind of the most politically engaged and praxis-oriented of the economic writings focused on the conflict between capital and workers. It also played, the Grundrisse, an important role in the development of the movement he co-founded, operaismo, or workerism. And in fact, Negri recounts that the operaismo movement itself found different value in different texts of Marx over different periods, gradually turning to the Grundrisse. So in another book, Marx in Movement, Negri explains, and this is Negri writing, at the beginning of workerism, the tendency was to focus on volume 2 of Capital, which analyzes the relationship between factory and society and the transition from extraction of surplus value in the factory to its accumulation to the level of social circulation. Then there was a shift to volume 3 of Capital, where the analysis moves up to the level of the abstraction of value and to the analysis of globalization. And that was followed by a shift to volume 1 of Capital, and to the Grundrisse, where the historical theme of the subjectivation of struggles is the principal starting point of analysis. I find that particularly interesting and important because it shows the ways in which Capital may be written as volume 1, 2, 3, and Marx may have wanted to enter in production, say, with, of course, volume 4 on surplus value. But the different ways in which the work can be used and the different way in which Marx's œuvre can be used means that one might want to enter in at a different place first and then gradually arrive, say, to the beginning point with volume 1. And here, of course, it's the Grundrisse that becomes so important, as we see in these lectures, Marx Beyond Marx. Now, Negri's book, Marx Beyond Marx, is intended, as its title suggests, to push us, with Marx, beyond Marx, in order for us to develop new ways of thinking about collective action and new ways of imagining a communist horizon. What Negri emphasizes is the subjectivities of the workers as a way to propel a vision of autonomous collective self-government, which became known as the autonomia and opéraisme movements. Also, you can think of autogestion in the French context, or workerism. Now, the book itself, Marx Beyond Marx, is the outgrowth of 9 lectures that Negri delivered in Louis Althusser's seminar at the École Normale Supérieure on the Rue d'Ulm in Paris in the spring of 1978. In terms of the timing of those lectures, it's important to recognize that the Grundrisse was first translated into French in 1967, 1968. But as Marcello Musto notes, it was of inferior quality, the translation, and had to be replaced by a more faithful one in 1980. But the first translation comes out in French in 67, 68, and he's delivering these lessons in 78, 10 years later, 2 years before the better version comes out. An Italian version, Musto tells us, had come out between 68 and 70. And so what you have to understand is the text is still very new to its Parisian and Western European readers when Negri is lecturing about the Grundrisse in Althusser's seminar in 1978. Now, as for Althusser, the timing is also interesting. As Musto notes, Althusser, he had made this proposal of an epistemological break. We've spoken about it a lot, particularly when we were looking at the theses on Feuerbach and the work from 1845, because that's when he situates the epistemological break. Althusser had this idea of an epistemological break between the early philosophical and political Marx and then the mature scientific and economic Marx. And that argument, which he develops in the 1960s and puts forth in 64, 65, has been criticized, but one of the sharp criticisms is that that doesn't incorporate the Grundrisse as a pivotal moment, or potentially as the bridge, right, that would explain an epistemological continuity. As I had mentioned, right, there are these epistemological continuities with the idea of alienation, for instance, that we lose sight of in Capital, but that are present in Grundrisse, and so tie the more political economy work directly to the older philosophical work. Musto is referring to many critics who have argued that Althusser really never read the Grundrisse, and that the whole epistemological break argument is undermined by the Grundrisse. Musto writes, even as Althusser attempted to make Marx's supposed silences speak and to read Capital in such a way as to make visible whatever invisible survivals there are in it. This is from Reading Capital, of course, which was from 1965. Althusser permitted himself to overlook the conspicuous mass of hundreds of written pages of the Grundrisse and to effect a later hotly debated division of Marxist thought into the works of his youth and the works of his maturity without taking cognizance of the content and significance of the manuscripts of 1857-58. Now, of course, what's interesting to realize, of course, that we can now, is that at the time of the seminars at the École Normale Supérieure that gave rise to the publication Reading Capital, so at the time of the seminars, 1964, the introduction to the Grundrisse was well known. It had been published in many languages as early as 1903 in French. And the full edition of the Grundrisse had been published in German, in East Germany, in 1953. But the whole Grundrisse was not a well-known tome. It was not the well-known tome that it would become today, and certainly not in 1964. Now, clearly, Althusser and all of his students who were reading texts in the original German could have given it a place, and it would have possibly emerged as that bridging text, possibly, in the 1960s. This isn't totally fair to Althusser. He did come back to revise his theory of an epistemological break several times, and so in several later works, he would come to soften it and revise it. But I think it was an absence that would have shifted possibly the reading of Marx in 1965 in Reading Capital. Now, what Toni Negri finds most powerful about the Grundrisse is that, by contrast to conventional Marxism, what is often called vulgar Marxism, or what he would like to critique as conventional Marxism, the Grundrisse allows us to see Marx as a militant and not just as a professor. Those are his words. On Negri's reading, which naturally goes beyond Marx, all the economic questions become political ones. Or, as he writes, all the problems of exploitation are by now immediate political problems. They become political problems based on an economic analysis. As Negri underscores, Marx's Grundrisse founds and undoes the law of value. In the Grundrisse, Marx appears as a communist militant who forces the theoretical limits of the classical analysis of value and who justifies communist hope. He does not deceive himself as to the immediacy of the process, but he does clarify its subjective necessity. The lectures, Negri's lectures, then, unearth the political and militant dimensions of the Grundrisse. For instance, the central conflict between capital and labor, the subjectivities of the workers and their evolving consciousness of the struggle, the emergence of the revolutionary subject from the relation with capital, the ways in which the theory of surplus value here provides the basis for class struggle, or, as Negri writes and emphasizes in italics, from money to surplus value, this is the political path that furnishes class weapons. So he writes, the Grundrisse constitutes the subjective approach, the imminent crisis, to the analysis of the revolutionary subjectivity in the process of capital. The notebooks, Negri writes, represent the strongest point of analysis and of imagination in the revolutionary will of Marx. All right, I could go on. The passages are legion and legendary. But Michael Hart and Sandro Mezzadra will develop precisely this point at our seminar, Marx 913. So let me then conclude with a final passage from the inimitable Toni Negri, a final passage that you find on page 163 of his book. Marx beyond Marx, italicized. Marx beyond Marx, beyond vulgar determinism, beyond all hypotheses implying homogeneity. The most ingenious revolutionary consciousness can find here plenty for the most sublime exaltation. Welcome to Marx 913. Thank you.